Audiobook summary presents Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. In the late winter months of 1801, a man named Lockwood rents a manor house called Thrushcross Grange in the isolated moor country of England. Here, he meets his dour landlord, Heathcliff, a wealthy man who lives in the ancient manor of Wuthering Heights, 4 miles away from the Grange. In this wild, stormy countryside, Lockwood asks his housekeeper, Nellie Dean, to tell him the story of Heathcliff and the strange denizens of Wuthering Heights. Nellie consents, and Lockwood writes down his recollections of her tale in his diary. These written recollections form the main part of Wuthering Heights. Nellie remembers her childhood. As a young girl, she works as a servant at Wuthering Heights for the owner of the manor, Mr. Earnshaw, and his family. One day, Mr. Earnshaw goes to Liverpool and returns home with an orphan boy whom he will raise with his own children. At first, the Earnshaw children, a boy named Hindley and his younger sister Catherine, detest the dark-skinned Heathcliff. But Catherine quickly comes to love him, and the two soon grow inseparable, spending their days playing on the moors. After his wife's death, Mr. Earnshaw grows to prefer Heathcliff to his own son, and when Hindley continues his cruelty to Heathcliff, Mr. Earnshaw sends Hindley away to college, keeping Heathcliff nearby. 3 years later, Mr. Earnshaw dies, and Hindley inherits Wuthering Heights. He returns with a wife, Frances, and immediately seeks revenge on Heathcliff. Once an orphan, later a pampered and favoured son, Heathcliff now finds himself treated as a common labourer, forced to work in the fields. Heathcliff continues his close relationship with Catherine, however. One night they wander to Thrushcross Grange, hoping to tease Edgar and Isabella Linton, the cowardly, snobbish children who live there. Catherine is bitten by a dog and is forced to stay at the Grange to recuperate for 5 weeks, during which time Mrs. Linton works to make her a proper young lady. By the time Catherine returns, she has become infatuated with Edgar, and her relationship with Heathcliff grows more complicated. When Frances dies after giving birth to a baby boy named Hareton, Hindley descends into the depths of alcoholism, and behaves even more cruelly and abusively toward Heathcliff. Eventually, Catherine's desire for social advancement prompts her to become engaged to Edgar Linton, despite her overpowering love for Heathcliff. Heathcliff runs away from Wuthering Heights, staying away for 3 years, and returning shortly after Catherine and Edgar's marriage. When Heathcliff returns, he immediately sets about seeking revenge on all who have wronged him. Having come into a vast and mysterious wealth, he deviously lends money to the drunken Hindley, knowing that Hindley will increase his debts and fall into deeper despondency. When Hindley dies, Heathcliff inherits the manor. He also places himself in line to inherit Thrushcross Grange by marrying Isabella Linton, whom he treats very cruelly. Catherine becomes ill, gives birth to a daughter, and dies. Heathcliff begs her spirit to remain on earth. She may take whatever form she will, she may haunt him, drive him mad, just as long as she does not leave him alone. Shortly thereafter, Isabella flees to London and gives birth to Heathcliff's son, named Linton after her family. She keeps the boy with her there. 13 years pass, during which Nellie Dean serves as Catherine's daughter's nursemaid at Thrushcross Grange. Young Catherine is beautiful and headstrong like her mother, but her temperament is modified by her father's gentler influence. Young Catherine grows up at the Grange with no knowledge of Wuthering Heights. One day, however, wandering through the moors, she discovers the manor, meets Hareton, and plays together with him. Soon afterwards, Isabella dies, and Linton comes to live with Heathcliff. Heathcliff treats his sickly, whining son even more cruelly than he treated the boy's mother. 3 years later, Catherine meets Heathcliff on the moors, and makes a visit to Wuthering Heights to meet Linton. She and Linton begin a secret romance conducted entirely through letters. When Nellie destroys Catherine's collection of letters, the girl begins sneaking out at night to spend time with her frail young lover, who asks her to come back and nurse him back to health. However, it quickly becomes apparent that Linton is pursuing Catherine only because Heathcliff is forcing him to. Heathcliff hopes that if Catherine marries Linton, his legal claim upon Thrushcross Grange and his revenge upon Edgar Linton will be complete. One day, as Edgar Linton grows ill and nears death, Heathcliff lures Nellie and Catherine back to Wuthering Heights, and holds them prisoner until Catherine marries Linton. Soon after the marriage, Edgar dies, and his death is quickly followed by the death of the sickly Linton. Heathcliff now controls both Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. He forces Catherine to live at Wuthering Heights and act as a common servant, while he rents Thrushcross Grange to Lockwood. Nellie's story ends as she reaches the present. Lockwood, appalled, ends his tenancy at Thrushcross Grange and returns to London. However, 6 months later, he pays a visit to Nellie, and learns of further developments in the story. Although Catherine originally mocked Hareton's ignorance and illiteracy, in an act of retribution, Heathcliff ended Hareton's education after Hindley died. Catherine grows to love Hareton as they live together at Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff becomes more and more obsessed with the memory of the elder Catherine, to the extent that he begins speaking to her ghost. Everything he sees reminds him of her. Shortly after a night spent walking on the moors, Heathcliff dies. Hareton and young Catherine inherit Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, and they plan to be married on the next New Year's Day. After hearing the end of the story, Lockwood goes to visit the graves of Catherine and Heathcliff. Chronology. The story of Wuthering Heights is told through flashbacks recorded in diary entries, and events are often presented out of chronological order. Lockwood's narrative takes place after Nellie's narrative, for instance, but is interspersed with Nellie's story in his journal. Nevertheless, the novel contains enough clues to enable an approximate reconstruction of its chronology, which was elaborately designed by Emily Brontë. For instance, Lockwood's diary entries are recorded in the late months of 1801 and in September 1802. In 1801, Nellie tells Lockwood that she has lived at Thrushcross Grange for 18 years, since Catherine's marriage to Edgar, which must then have occurred in 1783. We know that Catherine was engaged to Edgar for 3 years, and that Nellie was 22 when they were engaged, so the engagement must have taken place in 1780, and Nellie must have been born in 1758. Since Nellie is a few years older than Catherine, and since Lockwood comments that Heathcliff is about 40 years old in 1801, it stands to reason that Heathcliff and Catherine were born around 1761, 3 years after Nellie. There are several other clues like this in the novel, such as Hareton's birth, which occurs in June 1778. The following chronology is based on those clues, and should closely approximate the timing of the novel's important events. A before a date indicates that it cannot be precisely determined from the evidence in the novel, but only closely estimated. 1500. The stone above the front door of Wuthering Heights, bearing the name of Hareton Earnshaw, is inscribed, possibly to mark the completion of the house. 1758. Nellie is born. 1761. Heathcliff and Catherine are born. 1767. Mr. Earnshaw brings Heathcliff to live at Wuthering Heights. 1774. Mr. Earnshaw sends Hindley away to college. 1777. Mr. Earnshaw dies. Hindley and Francis take possession of Wuthering Heights. Catherine first visits Thrushcross Grange around Christmas time. 1778. Hareton is born in June. Francis dies. Hindley begins his slide into alcoholism. 1780. Catherine becomes engaged to Edgar Linton. Heathcliff leaves Wuthering Heights. 1783. Catherine and Edgar are married. Heathcliff arrives at Thrushcross Grange in September. 1784. Heathcliff and Isabella elope in the early part of the year. Catherine becomes ill with brain fever. Young Catherine is born late in the year. Catherine dies. 1785. Early in the year, Isabella flees Wuthering Heights and settles in London. Linton is born. 1785. Hindley dies. Heathcliff inherits Wuthering Heights. 1797. Young Catherine meets Hareton and visits Wuthering Heights for the first time. Linton comes from London after Isabella dies, in late 1797 or early 1798. 1800. Young Catherine stages her romance with Linton in the winter. 1801. Early in the year, young Catherine is imprisoned by Heathcliff and forced to marry Linton. Edgar Linton dies. Linton dies. Heathcliff assumes control of Thrushcross Grange. Late in the year, Lockwood rents the Grange from Heathcliff and begins his tenancy. In a winter storm, Lockwood takes ill and begins conversing with Nellie Dean. 1801 to 1802. During the winter, Nellie narrates her story for Lockwood. 1802 in spring, Lockwood returns to London, Catherine and Hareton fall in love, Heathcliff dies, Lockwood returns in September and hears the end of the story from Nellie. 1803 on New Year's Day, young Catherine and Hareton plan to be married.